Hello. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever driven across the plains after midnight, when the road feels longer than it should and the dark presses in so close it feels like it's listening? Out here, the land comes first. Endless prairie, rolling but empty, grass that whispers even when there's no wind. The sky feels bigger than anywhere else, and at first, that vastness is calming, peaceful, honest, but stay long enough, and that calm starts to stretch. The silence deepens. The distances stop making sense. Radio signals fade. Headlights don't reach as far as they should. And eventually, you realize something unsettling. This land doesn't feel uninhabited. It feels watchful. If you've ever been near a place like this, some of that felt too quiet for its own good, let me know. And if you haven't, listen closely. My name is Evan Red Cloud. I'm a Lakota Tribal Ranger, stationed on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I've worn the badge for 14 years. Search and rescue, wildlife enforcement, missing persons, land patrols. Out here, we cover nearly 3,500 square miles with fewer than a dozen rangers on rotation. Some nights, it's one of us for every 70 square miles of land. No backup for an hour. Sometimes more. Sometimes never. People think the danger comes from animals, or weather, or desperate men. But that's not what keeps you awake. Working this land is lonely, it's understaffed, and it's unpredictable in ways no briefing prepares you for. The elders try to warn us, but warnings don't mean much until you live through them. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong. There are things I've learned out here that don't exist in any ranger manual. Things they don't teach in training. Things that will never appear in an official report. Some truths are passed down quietly, and some are only learned when the land decides you're ready. The night star like dozens before it. The kind of shift that settles into your bones before you even turn the key. The sky was moonless, clouds stretched in like ash, and the prairie rolled out ahead of my headlights in long, empty waves. I checked in with dispatch just after 11:40 p.m., my voice steady, routine. Static answered back, then cleared. Normal. I drove on, tires humming over cracked asphalt. The reservation road pulling me farther from the lights and closer to the dark places most people never see. 10 minutes later, my radio went silent. Not static, not interference. Just nothing. I tapped the handset once, then harder, listening for familiar hiss. There was no dead channel tone, no feedback. It was as if sound itself had been removed. I checked the dashboard. Everything else worked fine. Engine, lights, GPS. But the radio might as well have been a brick. I slowed instinctively, scanning the road, feeling that old pressure rise behind my eyes. Out here, radio silence wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. I rolled my window down to listen for the land, and that's when I noticed what was wrong. No insects. No wind moving through the grass. Not even the distant bark of a dog or the shuffle of something small in the brush. The prairie, usually alive with quiet noise, felt sealed shut. My tires sounded too loud. My breathing did too. It felt like driving through a photograph instead of a place. The world flattened and holding still. The road narrowed into an unlit access stretch I knew well, abandoned years back after a pipeline survey fell through. I told myself to turn around. I didn't. Instead, my headlights caught something pale ahead, just off the shoulder. I eased to stop, pulse ticking in my ears. At first, I thought it was a signpost or a fence marker. Then it shifted, just enough to be wrong. A person stood there. They were upright, facing the road, arms hanging loose at their sides. No reflective gear. No flashlight. No movement at all. Even from a distance, something about the posture felt unnatural, like a mannequin set out in the open. I reached for the radio again out of reflex, thumb pressing the transmit button. Still nothing. I swallowed and leaned forward, trying to make out details through the windshield glare. That was when my headlights flickered. Just once. A brief dimming, like I'd blinked too hard. When the beam steadied, the figure was closer, not walking, not running. Just closer. The distance it had crossed made no sense. My stomach dropped, and every warning I'd ever half ignored pressed forward in my mind. I locked the doors without realizing I'd reach for them, my hand shaking against the plastic. "Hey!" I called out, hating how small my voice sounded in the cab. The words seemed to vanish before it reached the glass. The figure didn't respond. It didn't tilt its head. It didn't breathe. The silence around it felt heavier, denser, like the air itself had weight. I told myself it was a person in shock, or someone playing a stupid, dangerous game. That explanation felt thin even as I thought it. I shifted the truck into reverse. The engine growled, loud and wrong in the stillness. As I backed up, the figure stayed exactly where it was in my headlights, neither advancing nor retreating. Then the radio crackled. Not static, not a voice, just a soft, wet sound, like breath moving across a microphone that shouldn't have been connected. My hands froze on the wheel. The display remained dark. I hadn't regained signal. Whatever that sound was, it wasn't coming through any channel I recognized. I whispered my own name without meaning to a grounding habit drilled into me years ago. The sound came back instantly, clearer now, shaped by something that knew how voices worked but didn't quite belong to one. Evan. It spoke from the radio, slow and careful, as if tasting the word. The figure outside didn't move. The silence pressing tighter, and in that moment, standing alone on that dead road, I understood something I'd never fully believed before. The elders hadn't been telling stories to scare us. They had been warning us. After the night the radios went quiet, I didn't file anything unusual. There was no box on the report form for voice used my name over a dead channel. I wrote up a minor equipment malfunction, noted poor reception, and kept my distance from that access road for the rest of the shift. That's how you survive out here, by learning which truths to keep out of ink. Still, the silence followed me home, settling into my thoughts like frost. That winter was my first on solo patrol. Snow came early and stayed late, turning the reservation into a wide, white plain where landmarks vanish and distances lied. I was young enough then to think I could map everything, label it, understand it. Warning sounded like superstition to me, well-meaning but outdated. I trusted training manuals, radios, and procedures. The land, I thought, was just land. The elders didn't think that way. A few weeks after that patrol, I attended a community meeting at the old cultural center. Officially, it was about winter safety and livestock concerns. Unofficially, it was where things were said without being written down. I sat near the back in uniform, feeling out of place, listening more than speaking. When the topic drifted, as it always did, toward disappearances and strange sounds on the outskirts, the room grew quieter. No one used a name. They spoke around the subject, circling it carefully, like stepping around thin ice. One elder described those who do not carry sound with them. Another mentioned the ones who listen but do not answer. Each phrase felt deliberate, chosen to avoid something heavier. When someone younger asked directly what they meant, an older woman shook her head gently and said, "We don't call them. Calling is how you invite." I remember rolling my eyes, just a little, not enough to be disrespectful, but enough to tell myself I was above this. Stories change over generations. Fear fills in gaps. That's what I believed then. As the meeting continued, the elders shared rules, not instructions, not explanations. Rules. Don't follow voices you hear in open land, especially if they sound familiar. Don't answer whistles at night, no matter how close they seem. And if you see something standing where it shouldn't, you keep your eyes forward and your mouth closed. Never acknowledge it. Never let it know you noticed. I told myself these were cautionary tales meant to keep kids from wandering off or panicking in the dark. But the way they spoke didn't match that intention. There was no drama in their voices, no attempt to scare, just a flat seriousness, the kind that comes from long memory. When someone asked why, the answer was always the same, because that's how it's always been. One elder, Thomas Black Elk, caught my eye as I listened. He'd been quiet until then, hands folded over a cane polished smooth with age. When he finally spoke, the room leaned in. He said the land remembers everything that happens on it, not metaphorically, literally, and sometimes memory walks. I almost laughed. Almost. Then something strange happened. Another elder, seated across the room, added a detail about how these beings never approach with sound. Footsteps don't crunch. Grass doesn't move. Wind dies before they arrive. A third elder nodded and added that animals sense them first, that dogs refuse to follow their trail. No one contradicted anyone else. No one corrected details. They weren't building a story together. They were recalling the same one from different angles. That's when the unease started. I realized they weren't describing spirits. They weren't talking about animals, no matter how clever or dangerous. And they weren't talking about people. These things, whoever they were, belonged to the land the way rivers and stones did. But wrong, like a scar belongs to skin. They didn't hunt. They waited. They didn't chase. They listened. After the meeting, I asked Thomas Black Elk directly if he meant something like skinwalkers, the word slipping out before I could stop it. His eyes hardened, not with anger, but with warning. Those are different, he said. Loud things. These are quieter. Then he told me something I still haven't written in any report. The silent ones. He didn't like that name, but he used it for my benefit. Aren't evil in the way stories make monsters evil. They're persistent. They exist because something else happened first. I drove home that night thinking about patterns, about how stories shift when they're passed along. Except these hadn't shifted. The details lined up too well. Every elder, from different families in different districts, described the same rules, the same silence, the same wrongness. They hadn't compared notes. They didn't need to. I told myself coincidence was powerful. Shared history does that. But the next week, on patrol, I noticed how often I caught myself listening for whistles. How the wind dropping suddenly made my shoulders tense. How I stopped calling out to shapes in the distance. Skepticism doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. The real crack came when I started reviewing old incident logs, unofficial ones kept in a locked drawer at the ranger station. Missing persons. Livestock found untouched, bloodless. Search efforts that stalled in open ground with no explanation. The same locations came up again and again, places the elders had called listening grounds. Places I had driven past without a second thought. By the time the first call came in about a missing teenager later that winter, I no longer believed the stories were just stories. I believed they were instructions. And I was about to find out what happens when someone breaks them. The call came in just before dawn, when the cold settles deepest and the world feels unfinished. Dispatch said a 14-year-old boy hadn't come home the night before. He lived less than a mile from his aunt's house, down a gravel road I'd driven 100 times. No history of running off. No arguments. He'd left after dinner to walk a cousin home and never returned. By the time I pulled up, the sky was pale and empty, snow crusted over the grass like a thin shell. Family members stood clustered near the porch, wrapped in coats and worry, their voices low. I recognized the look in their eyes, the awful balance between hope and knowing. I told myself this would be simple. Kids wander. Kids get turned around. That belief lasted until we reached the place where his footprints ended. They stopped in the middle of open ground. No fence, no ditch, no trees close enough to hide behind. One moment. There were clear boot impressions in the snow, steady and evenly spaced. The next, there was nothing. No drag marks, no scuffing, no sign of a fall or a struggle. It looked like someone had erased him cleanly from the land. I knelt and ran a gloved hand over the snow, half expecting to feel something wrong beneath it. The ground was solid, untouched. A search team spread out, moving slowly, methodically, calling his name. The sound carried farther than it should have. Too far. The prairie answered with nothing. We brought an AK-9 unit by mid-morning. The handler was experienced, confident. The dog caught the scent quickly and followed it without hesitation, straight to the point where the tracks ended. Then it stopped. Its ears flattened. It whined low in its throat and backed away, pulling against the harness hard enough to nearly topple its handler. No amount of coaxing would get it to move forward. Eventually, the handler shook his head and said he'd never seen that reaction before. I had. Standing there, watching that dog refuse to land itself. Something from the elders' meeting surfaced in my mind. uninvited. Animals sense them first. I push the thought away and focus on procedure. Grids, timelines, probabilities. But the facts refuse to line up. People disappear into forests, into water, into bad decisions. They don't vanish from open ground in daylight conditions, unless they were taken. As the hours passed, I started seeing the pattern I'd missed before. Every missing person case that had ended like this shared the same shape. Short distances, familiar routes, sudden absence, no evidence of panic, no signs of pursuit. It was as if the land itself had decided to forget them. We searched until nightfall and found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no broken brush. When the call was made to suspend the active search, the family cried in a way that doesn't fade from your memory. I drove back to the station in silence, heater blasting against the cold that had settled into my chest. That night, I dreamed of the boy. I was sitting in my patrol truck, engine idling, headlights cutting into darkness. He stood just beyond the beams, close enough that I could see his face clearly. His eyes were open and focused on me, unblinking. His mouth hung open as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out, not even breath. The silence around him felt thick, pressing against the glass. I woke with my heart racing, my own name caught in my throat. I told myself it was stress. Brains look for meaning where there isn't any. But the next morning, when I checked the unofficial logs again, I saw the same notes scribbled in different hands over decades. Tracks ended abruptly. Dog refused to continue. Witness reported silence. No conclusions, just observations, stacked on top of each other like stones marking a grave no one wanted to dig. Over the following weeks, I drove those listening grounds more often than I should have. I told myself it was diligence. Truth was, I want to understand. Each place felt subtly wrong, like a room where sound doesn't echo the way it should. Radios lost signal more frequently. Wind died without warning. Once, I saw a line of deer standing perfectly still at the edge of field, all of them facing the same empty stretch of grass, none of them chewing or shifting their weight. I didn't stop. The boy was never found. Officially, the case went cold. Unofficially, his name was added to a list the elders didn't keep written down. When I saw his aunt weeks later, she told me something that tightened my throat. Some nights, she said, she heard footsteps outside her house that never reached the porch. Some mornings, the dogs refused to go out until the sun was fully up. I thought again of Thomas Black Elk's words. They listen, and for the first time, I wondered what it meant when the land listened back. It was around then that I started marking maps differently, not with roads and boundaries, but with absences, places where sound died, where animals hesitated, where people went missing before they were ever truly gone. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and it was leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go, toward the places the elders avoided, toward the places where the land felt like it was waiting. By the time the search call came in, I already knew it wouldn't end cleanly. It was still dark, that thin hour before sunrise when the land feels unfinished, like it hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. Dispatch told me a 14-year-old boy named Caleb White Owl hadn't made it home. He'd left his aunt's house just after dinner, planning to walk his younger cousin back, and then cut across the fields to his own place. Less than a mile, a route he'd walked dozens of times. Kids go missing for all kinds of reasons. That's what I told myself as I drove. But my hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I kept glancing at the radio, half expecting it to go dead again. The family was already gathered when I arrived. No shouting, no panic yet. Just that heavy, suspended quiet I'd learned to dread. Caleb's boots sat by the porch steps, another pair borrowed from a cousin, and returned before he left. His jacket was gone. That detail stuck with me. People who plan to disappear don't dress for a short walk home in winter. We followed his path along the gravel road until the snow held clear impressions, boot prints, steady and evenly spaced, leading off toward open land. I crouched to examine them, the cold biting through my gloves. There was nothing unusual at first glance. No dragging, no hesitation, no indication he'd stopped or turned back. And then the tracks just ended, not faded, not scattered. Gone. One step existed. The next simply didn't. Open grass in every direction. Snow untouched except the prints that led nowhere. I stood slowly, scanning the horizon, waiting for logic to reassert itself. There was no fence, no culvert, no ditch hidden by drift. Nothing a boy could have fallen into without leaving a mark. Search teams spread out, moving carefully, calling his name in measured intervals. Their voices carried too far across the plain, stretched thin by the cold air. I hated how sound behaved out there. It felt like it didn't belong to us, like it was being borrowed. By mid-morning, we brought an AK-9 unit from Rapid City. The handler was calm, professional, unfazed by rough terrain. The dog caught the scent quickly and followed it without hesitation, tail up, confident, straight to the point where the tracks ended. Then it stopped. The dog froze, ears flattening against its head. It let out a low, distressed whine and took several steps backward, pulling hard against the harness. The handler tried soothing commands. Praise, pressure, nothing worked. The dog refused to move forward, planting its paws as if the ground ahead burned. The handler looked at me, unsettled. It's like the scent just drops off, he said. Not fades, drops. I nodded, saying nothing. I'd seen that exact phrasing before, written in pencil in margins of old reports. The dog was pulled away eventually, still whining, still watching the empty grass like it expected something to step out. Hours passed. We found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no disturbed earth, just absence. As the search expanded, I started seeing the pattern again, clearer now that I couldn't pretend it was coincidence. The cases that haunted the elders weren't the dramatic ones. They were the quiet disappearances, short distances, familiar paths. No struggle, no sound. People didn't disappear into the land. They vanished from it. When night fell, command made the call to suspend active searching until morning. I watched Caleb's aunt fold into herself as she heard the words, hope collapsing inward instead of breaking outward. I'd learned that sound too. The sound of someone realizing the land had decided something. I drove back alone, headlights cutting tunnels through darkness. The radio stayed on, humming faintly, behaving itself. That somehow made it worse. I kept thinking about the tracks, about the dog, about the way the wind had died completely near that spot, as if the prairie itself had leaned in to listen. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it dragged me somewhere I didn't want to be. I was in my patrol truck, engine idling, parked on an unmarked road. The dashboard lights glowed softly. Everything normal, everything wrong. I felt watched but couldn't say how. Then I saw him. Caleb stood just outside the reach of my headlights, close enough that I could see the frost clinging to his eyelashes. His eyes were wide and fixed on me. His mouth hung open, stretched slightly too far, as if he were trying to scream without knowing how. No sound came out, not a breath, not a whisper. I tried to move. I couldn't. The silence around him thickened until it felt physical, pressing against the windows, against my chest. He lifted one hand slowly, fingers twitching, and for a moment I thought he was going to knock on the glass. I woke gasping, my own name echoing in my head, though no one had said it. I sat there for a long time, listening to my house settle, waiting for the quiet to feel normal again. It didn't. The next morning, I went to the station early and pulled the old drawer open, the one no one talked about, the unofficial logs, handwritten notes, half forms, pages never scanned or filed. Every case like Caleb's shared the same traits. Abrupt endings, dogs refusing to continue, witnesses mentioning sudden silence, locations overlapping the listening ground the elders had warned about. The realization hit me slowly and then all at once. These weren't isolated incidents. They were repetitions. Caleb was never found. Officially, the case cooled. Unofficially, his name was remembered in rooms where voices stayed low and doors stayed closed. Weeks later, his aunt told me the dogs refused to go outside before sunrise. She said sometimes she heard footsteps circling the house that never reached the porch. I started marking my maps differently after that, not with roads or patrol routes, but with absences. places where sound failed, where animals hesitated, where people went missing before they were ever truly gone. And the more I looked, the clearer it became. The land wasn't empty. It was holding its breath. After I realized the land was holding its breath, I couldn't stop listening for it. I stopped thinking in terms of patrol routes and started thinking in patterns. Late at night, when the station was quiet and the heater clicked like it was counting time, I spread maps across the table. Old paper ones, new satellite prints, even hand-drawn boundary charts the elders preferred. I marked every disappearance I could find. Official cases, unofficial notes, stories that never made it past kitchen tables. When I stepped back, the pattern was unmistakable. They clustered, not randomly, not evenly. They gathered around shallow valleys, low-lying stretches where the land dipped just enough to feel enclosed without offering shelter. Places where sound carried strangely. Places the elders called listening grounds. The name fit too well. During the day, these areas looked unremarkable. Grassland, sparse trees, occasional rock outcrops smoothed by weather. But every time I parked and stepped out, something felt off. The wind would move everywhere except where I stood. Birds circled but never landed. Even my own footsteps sounded delayed, like the ground took a moment to acknowledge them. The first time I noticed my compass drifting, I told myself it was cheap equipment. The needle refused to settle, spinning lazily even when I stood still. My phone GPS lagged by several seconds, the blue sliding after I'd already stopped walking. Time felt elastic. 10 minutes passed too quickly. An hour dragged like it was resisting movement. Sound was the worst part. In listening grounds, noise didn't behave properly. A cough sounded distant, even when it came from my own chest. A drop stone made no impact noise at all, just vanished mid-fall like it had been swallowed. When I spoke, my voice felt wrong in my ears, flatter, thinner, as if the air didn't want to carry it. I started documenting everything privately, a notebook that never left my jacket. Dates, coordinates, sensations, equipment behavior. I wrote like a scientist pretending objectivity could save me. None of it went into official reports. I already knew what would happen if it did. Best case, I'd be reassigned. Worst case, I'd be ignored until something went wrong. The elders noticed my interest. One afternoon, Thomas Black Elk found me near a listening ground I'd marked in red. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just said, "You feel it now, don't you?" I nodded. He told me these places weren't cursed or haunted. They were occupied, not by bodies, but by attention. Some things don't move much, he said. They stay where they learn to listen. I asked what they listened for. He didn't answer. The first full encounter happened 2 weeks later, just after sunset. I convinced myself I could handle it if I stayed cautious. I parked at the edge of one of the most active listening grounds. Engine off, lights dark. The silence settled immediately, deep and complete. My ears started to ache, a low pressure building like altitude sickness without the height. At first, I thought the shadows were just clouds. Then they moved against the direction of the fading light, not sliding, not stretching, shifting independently, pooling where no object stood to cast them. I watched as one shadow elongated, folding into a shape that suggested shoulders, a head, but never fully resolving. My eyes kept trying to finish it, to make a human. They couldn't. The pressure in my ears intensified until I thought my eardrums might burst. It felt like the moment before a thunderclap that never comes. The world held still, suspended. I realized then that the silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. Something moved closer. I didn't hear it. I felt it. The way you feel someone standing too near behind you. The grass around me didn't shift. No insect stirred. The shape ahead wavered, as if struggling to maintain form. I understood with terrifying clarity that was aware of me, not as prey, not yet, but as a sound-producing problem. I remembered the rules. Don't follow voices. Don't answer whistles. And most important, never acknowledge them if you see them. I kept my eyes unfocused, staring just past the shape. My breathing slowed until my chest burned. The pressure peaked, then eased slightly, like disappointment. The shadow collapsed back into nothing, draining away into ground. Only then did the wind return. I stumbled back to my truck, hands shaking, heart hammering loud enough that I was sure I could hear it. The radio crackled faintly as I started the engine, a blessedly normal sound. I drove away without looking back. That night, I filled pages in my notebook. Every detail, every sensation. I didn't sleep. After that, the encounters became more frequent, not always visual. Sometimes it was a sense of being counted. Sometimes it was the way my name felt heavy in my mouth when I thought it too clearly. Once, I saw a line of shadows standing perfectly still along a ridge, all facing inward toward a low point in the land, as if attending a meeting. I stopped going to listening grounds alone. I also stopped pretending this would stay contained. The elders had lived with these things for generations by respecting the rules and keeping distance. But the land had changed. Roads cut through old boundaries. Lights reached places they never had before. People wandered with phones and headphones, unaware of how loud they were to something that lived in silence. My private records grew thicker. I hid them well. If anyone ever found them, I'd be done. But I couldn't stop. Someone had to remember accurately. Someone had to notice when patterns shifted. And they were shifting. The shadows came closer now. The silence lingered longer after I left. Once, my radio lost signal for a full minute in a place it never had before. When it came back, there was a breath on the line that wasn't mine. I knew then that mapping the listening grounds wasn't enough anymore. They weren't just places marked by absence. They were spreading. After I realized the listening grounds were spreading, I told myself home would be different. Home had walls, power lines, running water, familiar noise. The land stopped at the edge of the driveway, replaced by insulation and drywall, and the quiet hum of appliances doing their jobs. That belief lasted less than a week. It started subtly, small enough that I could explain away if I wanted to. The refrigerator didn't cycle as often. When it did, the hum felt weaker, like it was being absorbed instead of filling the kitchen. The old clock above the sink still ticked, but the sound seemed farther away, as if I were hearing it through another room even when I stood right beneath it. I blamed exhaustion, long hours, too much cold air, and not enough sleep. Except the quiet kept finding me. Footsteps sounded wrong inside the house. Not silent, just muted, flattened. The floorboard still creaked, but without sharpness, like someone had wrapped the noise in cloth. When I spoke on the phone, conversations felt hollow, my own voice unfamiliar in my ears. I caught myself repeating words, checking that they existed outside my head. Sleep unraveled next. I'd lie awake for hours, listening to nothing. No distant traffic, no wind, no animals. Even the house, settling, seemed reluctant to make sound. When I did fall asleep, it never lasted. I woke, convinced someone was standing just out of sight, close enough that I could feel a tension pressing against me. The room always looked normal. Too normal. The knocking began on the fourth night. 3 soft taps, spaced evenly, from somewhere near the front door. Not loud enough to be urgent. Not quiet enough to be accidental. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, counting my breaths the way I'd been taught. The knocking didn't repeat. After several minutes, I forced myself to check. The porch was empty. No footprints in the frost. No movement in the yard. The air felt heavy, like it does before a storm that never comes. When I closed the door, the silence rushed back in behind me, thick and close. The knocking happened again 2 nights later. Same pattern, same result. It never continued once I stood up, like it was only meant to wake me, only meant to remind me that something knew where I lived. I stopped listening to music. It felt wrong to fill the house with sound, like shouting in a place that demanded quiet. Even the television volume stayed low, dialogue swallowed by the room. I started leaving lights on at night, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because the silence felt worse when I couldn't see. I hadn't told anyone yet, not officially, not even Thomas Black Elk. I didn't want to hear the confirmation in his voice, but the elders noticed anyway. They always did. He came by one afternoon without calling ahead, standing in my doorway with his coat still buttoned, eyes scanning the interior like he was reading something written on the walls. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask how I was sleeping. He just said, "They followed you." I felt my throat tighten. "That's not possible," I said automatically. "They're tied to the land." He nodded once. "Yes, and you are too." We stood there in the quiet, the refrigerator refusing to cycle, the clock ticking faintly like it was running out of energy. Thomas told me something the elders rarely said aloud. Once the silent ones notice you noticing them, distance stops meaning what you think it means. Attention is a kind of bridge. You don't carry them with you, but you teach them how to find you. The land doesn't end at your doorstep, he said. It never did. That night, I dreamed of my house standing alone in the prairie, walls gone, roof missing, just a shape outlined by moonlight. Shadows gather at the edges, not crossing the threshold, just waiting, listening. When I woke, the silence hadn't retreated. It had settled in. I started finding small signs I couldn't explain. The radio on my kitchen counter turned itself on once, volume set to 0, the display glowing softly like an open eye. My phone dropped calls only when I stood near the windows. Once, I thought I heard my name from the backyard, not spoken, not whispered, just implied, the way pressure implies depth. I didn't answer. The rules apply to home, too. Maybe more so. Days blurred together. I spent more time on patrol, less time inside my own walls, but it didn't help. The quiet rode with me, a familiar weight. Other rangers joked about burnout, about cabin fever, about me needing a vacation. I laughed at the right moments. I didn't tell them about the knocking, or how sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I felt like something else was listening through them. The worst part was how normal it all started to feel. Silence became background. Absence became expectation. I realized with a jolt that this was how people slipped into it, how they stopped resisting. The elders survived by naming the danger carefully, by never pretending it wasn't there. I'd been trying to compartmentalize it, to keep work and home separate. The land didn't respect that boundary. One evening, as I stood at the sink, I noticed my reflection lag slightly behind my movements. Just a fraction of a second. Enough to notice. Enough to tell me something was learning. I packed an overnight bag and drove to my sister's place 2 towns over. The quiet followed me there too, thinner but present, like a scent carried on clothes. Distance dulled it, but didn't erase it. When I returned home the next day, the front door was closed, locked, exactly how I'd left it. Inside, the house was silent in a way that felt satisfied, as if it had been waiting. I understood then that this wasn't escalation. It was progression. The silent ones weren't reaching out blindly anymore. They were adapting, testing how close they could get without breaking the rules that govern them. And somewhere out there, in the listening grounds I'd mapped so carefully, something had learned that I was paying attention, which meant sooner or later it would want more. And I knew the next time I heard a knock, it wouldn't stop when I stood up. The next knock came 3 nights later. It didn't come from the door. I was sitting at my kitchen table, notebook open, rereading my own handwriting like it belonged to someone else, when I heard it, 3 slow taps, steady and patient, from the wall behind me, not inside the wall, on it, as if something stood just beyond the siding, testing the structure. I didn't turn around. The sound stopped after a few seconds, replaced by that familiar pressure in my ears. When it finally faded, I knew I couldn't keep pretending I was figuring this out on my own. I called Thomas Black Elk before dawn and told him I was ready to listen properly. He told me to come alone. We met at a small, windowless building near the edge of the reservation, one I'd driven past for years without ever being invited inside. 2 other elders were there already, seated in folding chairs, faces unreadable. No one offered me coffee. No one wasted time. Thomas said, "What we tell you now doesn't get written down. Not by you. Not by us. If you forget it, that's on you." Then they gave me the rules. Not explanations. Not origins. Rules. Never patrol alone near listening grounds. Not because you'll be overpowered, but because attention splits when it has more than one source. Carry iron on you at all times, but don't trust it to protect you. Iron reminds them of boundaries, nothing more. Fire doesn't scare them. Light doesn't scare them. But movement does. Unpredictable, uneven movement that breaks expectation. Most important of all, never run. Running, they said, teaches them how you flee. It gives them a rhythm to follow. If you feel the urge to bolt, you slow down instead. You make yourself boring. You become unremarkable. I asked what happens if you break a rule. No one answered right away. Finally, one of the other elders said, "Then you learn why the rule exists." I left with my head full and my stomach tight. Knowing the rules didn't make me feel safer. It made the danger sharper, more defined, harder to deny. I adjusted my patrol habits immediately, avoided listening grounds at night, doubled up with other rangers whenever possible. I carried an old iron railroad spike wrapped in cloth in my jacket pocket, feeling ridiculous every time I touched it. For a while it worked. The silence stayed at a distance. The knocking didn't return. My sleep improved enough that I could function. I started to believe that obedience might be enough, that the elders had found a way to coexist with whatever listened from the land. That belief lasted until the night I broke the rules. It was an equipment check call, nothing urgent. A motion sensor had tripped near a restricted service road that cut close to a listening ground I'd marked months earlier. Dispatch was short-staffed. No one else was available. I told myself I'd just drive by, confirm it was a false alarm, and leave. I wouldn't get out of the truck. I wouldn't linger. I was alone. That was the first rule broken. The road felt wrong the moment I turned onto it. My headlights seemed dimmer, swallowed by darkness instead of cutting through it. The radio crackled, then steadied. Iron pressed heavy against my ribs where I'd tucked it, a useless comfort. I slowed as I approached the sensor post, scanning the edges of the light. That's when the engine stalled. No warning, no sputter, just silence. The sudden absence of sound hit harder than any noise ever could. My ears rang with pressure, that same held-breath feeling I'd come to dread. I reached for the ignition. Nothing. Dashboard lights flickered weakly, then went dark. I stayed still. Shadows shifted at the edge of the beams, though the lights themselves were fading. Shapes suggested themselves and then fell apart, like the land couldn't quite remember how to look solid. Something moved closer. I felt it in my chest, a pull like gravity changing direction. My instinct screamed at me to run. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and immediate. The ground crunched beneath my boots. Too loud, too clear. The shapes reacted. The pressure spiked. I realized then that I'd broken the worst rule of all. I ran. The moment I did, the world seemed to lurch. Shadows surged forward, not chasing so much as adjusting, aligning themselves with my movement. I could hear my own breath now, ragged and panicked, and beneath it, something else. Not footsteps, but a dragging absence that swallowed sound as it moved. I threw myself back into the truck, slamming the door, fumbling for the iron spike. The engine roared back to life without explanation as the first impact hit the side panel. Not a denting blow, but a heavy, dead pressure, like something leaning its full weight against the metal. Another impact followed. The truck rocked. I floored the accelerator. The tires spun, then caught. As I tore down the road, something scraped along the side of the truck, leaving deep grooves that shrieked like tortured metal before cutting off abruptly. The pressure vanished all at once. Wind returned. Sound rushed back like a flood. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, heart pounding so hard I thought it might break my ribs from the inside. At the station, under harsh fluorescent lights, I finally looked at the damage. Long, uneven gouges ran along the passenger side of the truck, too deep to be brush, too wide to be animal. The metal around them was cold to the touch, colder than the night air should have allowed. I didn't log the incident. I couldn't. What stayed with me wasn't the damage to the truck. It was a moment during the run, the brief, horrifying clarity when I understood something fundamental. They hadn't chased me because they were angry. They'd chased me because I'd taught them how. That night, as I lay awake listening to my own breathing, I realized the rules weren't just about survival. They were about limiting what the silent ones could learn. Every mistake fed them information. Every broken rule, made them smarter. And somewhere out there, in the dark places I could no longer avoid, something was adjusting its expectations, preparing for the next time I wouldn't be fast enough to recover. The next time someone else would answer a voice that wasn't meant to be answered. After the night I taught them how I ran, I stopped believing I could protect anyone else. That didn't stop the department from pairing me with a new ranger 2 weeks later. His name was Aaron Mills, early 30s, former state wildlife officer. Good evaluations, clean record, confident in the way people get when they've handled danger before and lived to tell the story. He'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone did. Radios cutting out, elders making requests that didn't fit protocol. He treated it all like local color. Every place has its ghost stories, he told me as we rolled out just after sunset. Keeps people respectful. I didn't argue. I'd learned that convincing someone never worked. Understanding only came after. The patrol route took us along the northern boundary, skirting one of the listening grounds I'd marked months earlier. I planned to pass it quickly, stay on the main road, keep the truck moving. Aaron leaned back in his seat, relaxed, scanning the prairie like he was cataloging wildlife. "You ever actually seen anything?" he asked casually. "Yes," I said. He smiled like that answered everything. We were halfway past the low stretch when the sound reached us. A child's voice. High, thin, trembling with fear. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, crying softly, calling for help, not screaming, not panicked, just scared enough to make your chest tighten. It came from the tall grass off the road, close enough that I could pinpoint the direction. I slammed the brakes. The world felt like it tilted inward. The silence around the sound was absolute, like the voice existed in a pocket cut out of reality. No insects, no wind, no echo. Aaron leaned forward. "Did you hear that?" "Yes," I said sharply, "and we're not stopping." The crying came again, clearer this time. "Please," it said, "I'm lost." Aaron reached for the door handle. "Don't." I snapped. "That is not a child." He hesitated, looking at me like I just failed some basic test of humanity. "What if it is?" he said. "What if someone actually needs help?" "That's how it works," I said. "They don't sound wrong. They sound right." The voice whimpered again, closer now. My ears started to ache, that pressure building fast. The radio stayed silent. The truck idled, loud and obscene in the stillness. Aaron shook his head. "I can't just ignore that." He opened the door. The moment his boots hit the ground, the crying stopped. Not fading, not trailing off. Cut cleanly, like someone had flipped a switch. The tall grass ahead of us stood perfectly still, unmoving despite the breeze I could feel against my face. "Aaron," I said slowly, forcing calm into my voice. "Get back in the truck. Now!" He didn't answer. He was staring into the grass, head tilted slightly, listening for something that wasn't there anymore. Then the voice spoke again. This time, it used his name. Aaron's shoulders relaxed. Just a fraction. That was all it took. "Hey!" he called back, stepping off the road. "It's okay. I'm right here." I was out of the truck before I realized I'd moved, iron spike cold in my hand. "Aaron!" I hissed. "Do not answer it. Do not go toward it." He waved me off without looking back. "You hear that? It knows my name. Kid's probably been wandering all night." The grass parted ahead of him without sound. No rustle, no snap of stems. Just a smooth opening, like something passing its hand through water. Shapes shifted inside, wrong silhouettes that never held still long enough to define themselves. Shadows moved where no light source existed, flowing against the angle of dusk. I followed at a distance, every instinct screaming, forcing myself to slow down instead. Each step felt like walking into deeper water. The pressure in my ears intensified until my vision tunneled. "Aaron," I said quieter now. "Stop." He took one more step. The grass closed behind him. The silence became total. I couldn't hear my own breathing, couldn't hear my heartbeat. It was like the world had decided sound was no longer necessary. Shapes moved all around us now, sliding through the grass without disturbing it, outlines suggesting arms, heads, torsos. Never resolving, never solid. Aaron turned, confusion finally breaking through his confidence. "Where'd it go?" he asked. His voice sounded wrong, distant, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Behind him, something leaned close. I didn't see it touch him. I saw him react. His breath caught. His mouth opened. No sound came out. I reached him in 3 long strides and grabbed his arm, yanking hard. For a split second, I felt resistance, not weight, not grip, but attention, focused and displeased. The pressure surged, crushing my ears, blurring my vision. Then Aaron was gone. Not pulled away, not dragged under, just absent. His arm slipped out of my grasp like it had never been there. The grass stood undisturbed. The shapes withdrew, dissolving back into shadow. Sound rushed back in all at once. I staggered, nearly falling, gasping like I'd been underwater too long. The child's voice didn't return. Nothing did. The listening ground felt satisfied, quiet in a way that made my stomach turn. I stood there for a long time, iron spike clenched so tightly my hand cramped, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I walked back to the truck alone. The official report said Aaron Mills resigned effective immediately due to personal reasons. No incident occurred. No evidence found. Search efforts were brief and inconclusive. Paperwork clean enough to sleep at night, if you were built that way. The elders didn't ask for details. When I told Thomas Black Elk that someone had answered back, he closed his eyes and nodded once. Later, I saw his name added quietly to a list kept in memory, not ink. A list that stretched back further than any of us wanted to count. That night, I dreamed of tall grass bending without wind, of voices practicing names like a language lesson. I woke knowing something else had changed. They weren't just listening anymore. They were learning who would come when called. After Aaron disappeared, the land fell closer. Not physically. Distances stayed the same. Roads still measure out the way maps said they should, but closer in the way a held breath feels close to breaking. The listening grounds didn't need me to visit anymore. I felt them even when I stayed away, like pressure changes before weather rolls in. Something fundamental had shifted, and the elders knew it before I said a word. Thomas Black Elk asked me to come back to the small building near the edge of the reservation, the one without windows. This time, there were more chairs filled, faces older than any report I'd ever read. No one spoke Aaron's name. They didn't have to. Loss like that travels ahead of you. You want to know why they don't leave? Thomas said once the door was closed. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He took a long breath, like he was steadying himself before stepping into cold water. They aren't roaming, he said. They never were. That's what outsiders get wrong. Predators move. These don't. Another elder, Mary Spotted Horse, continued where he left off. She spoke softly, carefully. The silent ones are bound, anchored to specific places the way scars are anchored to skin. They don't wander because they can't. They exist where something happened that never finished happening. Violence, displacement, broken promises layered, so thick they press into the land itself. Treaties signed and broken, camps cleared in winter, children taken, families scattered, deaths that were never marked properly, never mourned the way they should have been. The elders didn't frame it as punishment or revenge. They framed it as consequence. When grief has nowhere to go, it settles. When enough of it settles in one place, it changes what that place can hold. They aren't spirits, Thomas said again, firmer now. Spirits move on. These stayed. For generations, balance was maintained by distance and respect. People knew which low places not to linger in, which valleys to cross quickly, which silences not to interrupt. The rules weren't about fear. They were about coexistence. Ignoring the silent ones didn't make them weaker. It made them dormant. Then things changed. Roads cut straight lines through land that had never been crossed that way before. Searchlights swept places that had only known firelight. Radios filled the night with voices that traveled farther than voices should. Patrols lingered. Sensors blinked. People stopped listening to the land and started expecting it to behave. Mary looked directly at me when she said, "You woke them up," not accusing, observing. Modern patrols meant constant movement through listening grounds. Search and rescue calls meant shouting names into places that fed on names. Well-lit vehicles taught the silent ones how to shape themselves against light. Radios taught them cadence, rhythm, how to wait for gaps. Worst of all, compassion taught them bait. They learned because they had to. Thomas said, "You don't adapt, you disappear." Even things like them. I thought of Aaron, of the way the voice had sounded right, of how quickly the shapes had responded when I ran that night weeks earlier. I asked a question that had been tightening my chest since his disappearance. Can they leave now? The room went very still. Not fully, Mary said, but they don't need to anymore. They explained that the silent ones couldn't cross far beyond the places that formed them, not on their own, but attention created overlap. When someone noticed them deeply enough, tracked them, mapped them, feared them, the boundary thinned. It didn't let them roam free. It let them reach. I felt cold settle under my ribs. They're waking more often, Thomas said, and they're adjusting how the world is now, not how it was. They understand patrol schedules, light patterns, how long engines idle, how people respond when they think someone needs help. I thought of my notebook, of the private records, of how carefully I'd observed them, believing documentation with control. The realization tasted bitter. I asked why the elders were telling me all this now. Because you're already marked, Mary said gently, and because pretending you aren't won't protect anyone else. They told me something else then, something that made my mouth go dry. The list of names they kept in memory wasn't just a record of loss. It was a record of lessons. Each disappearance taught the silent ones something new, how to imitate urgency, how to test rules, how far they could push without resistance. Aaron answering back hadn't just been a mistake. It had been data. I left the meeting feeling older than when I'd arrived. The land outside looked the same, sky wide, grass bending, but I could feel the listening grounds like knots under the surface, tension waiting to be pulled tighter. In the days that followed, reports increased, not official missing persons yet, smaller things, sensors tripping where they never had, radios losing signal for seconds at a time, hunters reporting areas where sound dropped out entirely, dogs refusing to cross invisible lines, people laughing it off. For now, I adjusted patrol schedules again, pushing for changes that sounded reasonable on paper but avoided certain overlaps. I argued for reduced night presence in low-lying areas, citing equipment strain, officer safety. Some requests were granted, others weren't. Progress moved slower than adaptation. One night, driving home, I noticed a stretch of road where the wind died completely as I passed. My headlights dimmed just slightly, not enough to alarm anyone else, enough to make my hands tighten on the wheel. They were testing distance, testing patience, testing whether the old rules still worked in a louder world. I understood then that this wasn't a haunting. It was a negotiation that had been interrupted and restarted without clear terms. The silent ones couldn't leave the land, but they didn't need to if people kept bringing pieces of themselves into places where silence waited. The elders had survived by teaching restraint. Modern life taught exposure. As I pulled into my driveway that night, I sat in the truck longer than necessary, engine idling, listening to the normal sounds of a living place. I knew better now than to trust them completely. Somewhere out there, in the listening grounds that had learned my name, something was recalibrating, adjusting to new variables, new mistakes, new voices. And I knew the next chapter wouldn't be about why they couldn't leave. It would be about what happened when someone forgot the rules again. After that meeting, I started measuring time differently, not by shifts or days off, but by how long it had been since the silence last pressed close. Sometimes it was hours, sometimes minutes. The storms came more often, too, heavy, electrical systems rolling in fast from the west, the kind that swallowed radio signals and turned the sky into a low, flickering lid. The elders said storms made the listening grounds restless. Static filled the air, boundaries blurred. The night it happened, the weather moved in hard and fast. Wind howled across the prairie, rain coming down sideways, thunder rattling windows hard enough to shake dust loose from the station ceiling. Dispatch was already strained, juggling outages and downlines. I was halfway through logging equipment issues when the call came through. Restricted service road. Northern sector. Motion sensor activation. My stomach dropped. That road cut straight through one of the oldest listening grounds on my map. A place the elders avoided even in daylight. At night, during a storm, it should have been unthinkable. I keyed the radio and asked for confirmation. Static answered. Thick and heavy, then cleared just long enough for dispatch to repeat the location. No backup available. I hesitated too long. That was my mistake. By the time I pulled out, rain hammered the windshield so hard the wipers struggled to keep up. Lightning strobed the land in harsh white flashes, freezing the prairie into still images. The radio crackled sporadically, voices breaking up, then vanishing entirely as I turned onto the service road. The moment I crossed the boundary, the storm died. Not gradually, not naturally. 1 second. Rain lashed the truck. Thunder rolled close enough to vibrate my ribs. The next, everything stopped. No rain, no wind, no thunder. Even the engine sounded muted, like it was wrapped in insulation. The silence slammed down so hard it made my ears ring. I tried the radio. Nothing. No static. No dead tone. Absence. I slowed, heart pounding, scanning the road ahead. Headlights cut into darkness that seemed thicker than night should allow. The restricted area gate loomed ahead, half open, rusted chain swaying slightly despite the lack of wind. I knew, with a certainty that felt cold and precise, that dispatch hadn't sent me here. The call hadn't come from them. I should have turned around. Instead, I drove forward. The gate creaked as I pushed past. The sound swallowed instantly. Beyond it, the land dipped low, forming a shallow basin where the listening ground pooled. The pressure in my ears intensified, sharp enough to make my vision blur. Shapes gathered at the edge of the light. Too many to count, shifting and rearranging themselves like they were testing configurations. They stepped into the beams. Not fully, never fully, forms that suggested people without committing to the idea. Limbs bent at wrong angles. Heads tilted too far. Faces that were almost right until you noticed the eyes didn't reflect light the way eyes should. They stood silently, watching, learning. I stopped the truck. The engine died on its own. The silence deepened, becoming total, crushing. I felt like the only loud thing left in the world. Every heartbeat a beacon. The shapes moved closer, gliding rather than walking, grass flattening beneath them without sound. I realized then that this was what full attention felt like. They weren't hunting. They were assessing. One step close enough that the pressure spiked painfully, like my skull might split. Its outline wavered, struggling to hold form. I could see now that they weren't mimicking life so much as remembering it, assembling pieces without understanding how they fit together. A voice formed, not spoken aloud. Inside my head, layered and careful. Evan. They knew my name well now. Every rule I'd learned screamed at me. Don't run. Don't answer. Don't acknowledge. But none of the rules covered this. Being surrounded, isolated, fully seen. Training offered nothing. Weapons meant nothing. Iron pressed uselessly against my ribs. I remembered something Thomas Black Elk had said, almost in passing. If you feel the urge to act, don't. I did the only thing left. I turned the engine off completely. Even the lights. Darkness swallowed everything. I opened the door slowly, deliberately, and stepped out into the basin. The ground was cold beneath my boots. Solid. Real. I didn't move. I didn't look at them. I didn't think my name. I slowed my breathing until it barely existed. Let my thoughts scatter instead of focusing. Refuse to offer attention in any direction. I became stillness inside stillness. Not hiding. Not resisting. Uninteresting. The pressure mounted, then hovered. I felt them all around me. Shapes circling, leaning close, searching for reaction. The silence stretched, testing patience. Time stopped behaving normally. I couldn't tell if seconds or hours passed. Then, slowly, the pressure eased. One by one, the shapes lost cohesion, outlines unraveling like fog in sunlight. The silence loosened its grip, sound returning in cautious increments. Wind whispered faintly through grass. Far away, thunder rumbled again, unsure of itself. When I opened my eyes, the basin was empty. Rain resumed suddenly, soaking me to the skin. My truck's lights flickered back on, engine coughing to life like it had just woken from a deep sleep. The radio crackled, dispatch asking for a status update. Voice strained but real. I didn't answer right away. I drove out of the restricted area without looking back, hands steady despite the tremor running through me. Once I crossed the boundary, the storm hit full force again, rain and wind reclaiming the night like nothing had happened. At the station, I filed a report so bland it bordered on fiction. Sensor malfunction. Weather interference. No incident. That was the last call I ever answered without questioning its source. The elders listened when I told them what I'd done. Thomas nodded slowly, eyes heavy. "You made yourself quiet," he said. "That's older than any rule we teach now." It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a temporary agreement. In the days that followed, the silence receded slightly, as if considering its options. But I knew better than to believe it was over. They had tested me fully, learned my limits, learned what didn't work. And I understood something else then, something that carried a weight I couldn't shake. The silent ones weren't done. They were just adjusting their approach. And sooner or later, they would try again, on someone who didn't know how to stand still and disappear in plain sight. After the last call, I tried to go back to silence. Not the dangerous kind, the kind the elders practice, the kind where you don't speak unless you have to, where stories stay where they belong, past mouth to ear, never written down, never recorded. I believed, for a while, that surviving meant returning to that discipline, standing still, keeping my head down, letting the land settle. But the land didn't settle. It got louder in its own way. At first, it was subtle. More missing time reports. More sensors tripping near low ground. Hikers claiming their phones stopped recording in certain areas. Hunters saying sound dropped out, so completely it made them panic. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines. Just enough to create patterns if you were looking for them. I was looking. Development crews moved in next. Surveyors, construction teams, environmental assessors with clipboards and drones. New access roads cut across places I'd marked years earlier, with red ink and unease. Listening grounds were labeled low-impact zones. Temporary structures went up. Work lights burned through nights that had never known light before. The elders protested. Quietly, then formally, then desperately. Their objections were logged, reviewed, and ultimately overridden. Progress has a way of treating warnings like superstition when they don't come with charts and data. I watched the rules fail one by one. Not because they were wrong, but because the world they were designed for no longer existed. You can't tell people not to answer voices when they're trained to respond to cries for help. You can't teach someone not to document what they see when their first instinct is to record, upload, prove. You can't maintain distance when roads and signals erase distance by design. The silent ones noticed. Disappearances increased. Not just here. Everywhere land had been layered with unresolved loss and then disturbed again. Cases that never made national news. People who stepped off trails. Workers who walked into tall grass to relieve themselves and never came back. Vehicles found idling, doors open, no signs of struggle. The old rules assumed patience on both sides. The silent ones no longer had it. They weren't content to wait quietly in listening grounds, relying on accidents and ignorance. They'd learned urgency. They'd learned imitation. They'd learned that people will break rules for the right voice, the right name, the right tone of fear. And they'd learned something else too. They'd learned that no one wants to believe silence can be hostile. I'm telling you this now because the balance is gone. Because I've seen too many reports crossed out, downgraded, explained away. Because I've watched good people talk themselves out of their instincts. Because I know what it looks like when something adapts faster than the system's meant to contain it. I'm telling you this because pretending these things don't exist hasn't protected anyone. I don't expect belief. I didn't believe once. I expect recognition. The small, cold moment when a piece of this clicks into place for you. When you remember a time sound dropped out too suddenly. When a familiar voice called from somewhere it shouldn't have been. When you felt watched without being seen. If that's happened to you, it matters. The silent ones don't travel like animals. They don't haunt like ghosts. They persist. They overlap. They exploit attention the way fire exploits oxygen. Every time someone studies them too closely, records them, chases explanation, instead of instinct, the boundary thins. That's why I never wrote official reports about the worst encounters. Why the elders never named them directly. Why the rules were never written down. Documentation feels like control. It isn't. Understanding isn't protection either. Distance is. Disinterest is. Silence, chosen carefully, is survival. If you ever find yourself somewhere impossibly quiet, somewhere sound behaves wrong, where even your own breathing feels too loud, don't try to figure out. Don't test it. Don't call out. Don't take pictures. Don't check your equipment and assume failure explains it. Leave. Slowly. Calmly. Without panic. And if the silence learns your name, if it speaks it back to you in a voice that sounds perfect, do not answer. Not out loud. Not in your head. Names are bridges. Attention is an invitation. Curiosity is a signal flare in places that feed on it. I'm breaking silence now because the old way of keeping these stories contained no longer works. Too many people are walking into listening grounds without knowing what they are. Too many systems are designed to respond instead of retreat. Too many voices are filling spaces that should have been left alone. This isn't a warning meant to scare you. It's meant to slow you down. The elders survive by knowing when not to act, by accepting that some things don't need to be challenged, exposed, or solved. They understood that the land remembers everything, and that memory doesn't fade just because the world gets louder. The silent ones are still bound, but they're no longer dormant. They're listening more often now, learning faster, and every time someone answers back, the list grows longer, quietly and visibly, without anyone noticing until it's too late. If you take nothing else from this, take this. When the world goes silent around you for no clear reason, don't try to become part of that moment. Don't announce yourself. Don't demand explanation. Make yourself small. Make yourself boring. And walk away without teaching the silence anything new. You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan.